Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7. I'm glad you chose to spend some of your time today with me for another discussion in military history. Today, I'm going to continue with my series on the wartime career of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighter. Today's episode will look at the involvement of these aircraft in the heavy fighter squadrons of the German Luftwaffe that flew them against the Russians and their allies on the Eastern Front. I'm going to focus in particular on the battle of those stationed in the extreme northern portion of the theater, very high latitudes of the Arctic Sea coast. This will be the last episode covering the use of the 110 as an offensive heavy fighter. The next, and final episode of this series will turn to its career in the air defense of Germany against the Allies' strategic air campaign. My major source for this one is the book Arctic Bf-109 and 110 Aces by John Wheel. And of course I'll also be drawing from Bf-110 Zerstorer Aces of World War II by the same author. Before we start, I want to apologize in advance for some of the poor or inaccurate pronunciation of some of the various terms and place names. I know I'm guilty of that, and this episode has more that I'm likely to butcher than usual. I hope I can get some sympathy, since I'm sure many of you who read about these kind of things, or just about history in general, encounter many words and terms which you have read often but rarely if ever heard spoken. So, without further delay, let's turn our attention to the summer of 1941, to Germany gearing up for its long-preached crusade against Bolshevism and degeneracy, the attack on the Soviet Union. In the weeks leading up to the launch of Barbarossa, that is, in late May and into June of 1941, Luftwaffe commanders began concentrating an air group at the Norwegian Arctic seaport of Kirkenes to take part in the invasion. Its fighter component was drawn from the unit stationed in Norway, namely Fighter Wing 77, or as it's called in German Jagdgeschwader 77, abbreviated JG-77. This was subordinated to Luftwaffe 5, top-level Luftwaffe unit responsible for the extreme northern territories of the German conquest. JG-77 was the daylight fighter command, and most of its squadrons flew the short-range single-engine Bf-109, but its organization included a squadron of 110s based at Stavanger on the coast. These were used for a large proportion of fighter missions in this theater, which were flown in support of coastal shipping traffic and as patrols out over the North Sea. The fact that these missions involved long patrols over the ocean made the long-range twin-engine fighter attractive, and the maritime patrol mission had become a frequent one for the 110s since the Scandinavian campaigns, during which the Germans had acquired territories with long, exposed coastlines. The fact that most of the air-to-air action they were likely to encounter would be with other large multi-engine aircraft meant that the 110 could still be dominant in a pure fighter role. Kinds of threats likely to be encountered on the sea here, namely light naval forces, surface subs, and some armed cargo ships, were of a kind against which the ground attack capability of the 110 would prove very formidable. The squadron was a larger than normal one. It had been merged with the headquarters flight of the heavy fighter wing Zerstorer Geschwader 76, or ZG-76, which had been the original parent formation of the Stavanger squadron. This headquarters flight was known as the Geschwaderstab, and had 6 Bf-110s, bringing the total number of fighters at Stavanger to 18. These 18 Bf-110s were sent to Kirkenes as part of the build-up against the Russians. The squadron, designated 1Z JG-77, the Z indicating Zerstorer, was under the command of Oberleutnant Felix Maria Brandes. This unit was the sole heavy fighter squadron assigned to the build-up in the far north. 2 squadrons of single-engine Bf-109 fighters were also assigned to the area. These 3 squadrons made up the 4th group of JG-77, and were the fighter component of Fliegerführer Kirkenes, a temporary command set up to carry out this build-up. These squadrons would act as the nucleus around which a new fighter wing, JG-5, would be created to conduct fighter operations against the Russians in this area. This new command would be officially created only in 1942, some months after the fighting had begun. The 3 fighter squadrons of 4th Group JG-77 would be joined by 1 group of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, 6 squadrons of medium bomber and reconnaissance planes. This relatively small air force was intended to support not only German maritime activity in the far north, but also the German ground forces in the sector. These were composed of 2 divisions of mountain infantry under General Edward Dietl, and had as their objective the capture of the vital Arctic seaport of Murmansk. On the 22nd of June, the invasion was launched. German forces in the far north, here operating alongside their Finnish allies, advanced rapidly across the barren terrain. Most of the territory taken in this initial advance was Finnish land occupied by the Soviets in the 1940 Winter War. Within a week, the Axis forces had retaken the occupied parts of Finland, crossed the old pre-war border, and were pressing into the Soviet Union proper. However, after this initial onrush, the German advance stalled in the face of stiffening Russian resistance in the low mountainous terrain along the line of the river Litsa. The Germans were less than 100 kilometers, or about 60 miles, from Murmansk. This important port, through which the bulk of Allied assistance to Russia would pass, would remain in Soviet hands as the fighting bogged down and the two sides dug in along a north-south front running straight through the sector. Unlike the situation in the greater part of the Russian theater, the front lines here were to stabilize more or less in place and remain almost static for the next 3 years. The air battles over the Arctic front would take place over a battlefield somewhat reminiscent of the well-developed trench lines that characterized the First World War. The strategically important Murmansk-Moscow Railway traveled north-south parallel to the front, often less than 50 kilometers or about 30 miles behind the Russian lines. This route formed one of the very few links between the bulk of Soviet territory and the Arctic Ocean ports. Though not of tremendous commercial or industrial importance in peacetime, it would soon carry enormous quantities of aid sent by the Western Allies, brought on ships convoyed into the port. The early Luftwaffe effort in this sector would be concentrated against Murmansk and the railroad. The relatively stable situation on the ground meant that comparatively few air support missions would be flown in aid of the German ground forces. This was another important difference between the Arctic sector and much of the rest of the Russian front, and it meant that the air forces fought a battle between themselves that was much less involved with the operations of the ground army than elsewhere. Given that most Luftwaffe activity centered around the effort to cut off the Arctic Lend-Lease supply route and the port and the railroad that served it, this also gave the Arctic Air War more of a strategic character than was typical of Luftwaffe operations in the Eastern Front, which were overwhelmingly employed in close support of the ground forces. German planes would operate from two sets of airfields here. The northernmost set, centered on Kirkenes and Petsamo, and were situated on the Arctic Sea coast. Shorter distances to the area around Murmansk, where the major German effort would be concentrated, meant that these fields were usually preferred, and the Luftwaffe units operated most often from these fields. Another set was located further south in Finnish territory, in and near the towns of Rovaniemi and Alakurti. Less intensive operations were the norm in this sector, but the fields could be used to enable short-range Stukas and 109s to operate against threats to the southern sector of the Finnish lines and against the more southerly sections of the Murmansk to Moscow Railroad. These southern fields would see more activity in the deep winter months. Long Arctic darkness of late December through early February, coupled with the more severe winter weather, often made operations in the extreme north impossible. Even in the area of the more southerly airfields, light in the deep winter was limited to only about 90 minutes of more or less bright twilight around noon. During the months of maximum darkness, only a single squadron of 109s were kept based at the northern fields, and this one was unable to operate much of the time. With the coming of more reasonable conditions toward the end of February, Luftwaffe units would migrate back to the critical northern sector. Before continuing with the squadron in the Arctic, let's take a brief look at the remainder of the 110 units involved in the invasion of Stalin's empire. I'm going to treat these only briefly, as by and large their experience differs little from that of Zerstörer in the earlier Blitzkrieg-style campaigns which we have been covering in the previous episodes. In the last episode, we looked at the battle fought by the Zerstörers of ZG-26 in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. After wrapping things up there, first and second groups of this wing were pulled back to Germany and then committed to the Russian attack. Two other groups of 110s would also fly with the German invasion forces, not as Zerstörers, but in so-called Schnellkampf units. This term translates to fast bomber, and these 6 squadrons of 110s operated in a pure ground attack role. Given the circumstances of the early Russian campaign, the missions of these 4 110 groups were hardly distinguishable in practice. The great majority of all their missions were flown in close support of Axis ground forces. Air opposition was surprisingly limited, largely because of the massacres of Red Air Force assets in the opening days of the invasion. Significant air-to-air action only took place in the region of Leningrad, over which the squadrons of ZG-26 were flying bomber escort missions by the closing months of the year. They would fight in the vicinity of Leningrad for several months, by far the majority of their tour of duty on the Russian front. This would total 10 months in the Russian theater, the heavy fighters being withdrawn to Germany in the winter of 1942 to rest and refit. They would then be sent back to Russia to operate in the area of Smolensk and Vitebsk, but remained there only for a short time before returning to Germany to complete their long-delayed transition into the expanding night fighter arm. This was accomplished by the end of April 1942. The 2 Schnellkampf groups would remain in the Russian theater for the best part of the next year, following the German advance ever deeper into Russia. They would participate in the climactic battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, flying numerous bombing and strafing missions against the Red Army in these colossal battles. An idea of what kind of fighting they did there can be gained by looking at the record of one pilot, Johannes Kiel. On March 18, 1942, this pilot was awarded the Knight's Cross for his achievements against the Soviets, which included 20 air-to-air victories, 62 planes destroyed on the ground, 9 tanks and 20 pieces of artillery knocked out, as well as a submarine, 3 torpedo boats, and a cargo ship sunk. Around the time of his receiving this award, the Schnellkampf designation was dropped, and the groups were reconstituted as Groups 1 and 2 of a reactivated ZG-1. The third group was created to fill out this wing, flying Bf-109s and the 110's doomed successor design, the 210. In mid-1943, all elements of this new ZG-1 would be transferred to North Africa to join the single group of 110s fighting in support of the now doomed Axis army there. Despite the large and growing Allied superiority of force in the Mediterranean region, fighting there must have seemed pretty small potatoes to the Zerstorer crews after their experiences in the enormous battles fought against the Russians. These units would be pulled out of the Mediterranean and back to Germany in early 1944. So now, let's continue our look at the battle fought by their comrades in the far north. The Russians operated their air units from a clutch of airfields around Murmansk. Early on, the Soviets met the Germans with obsolescent I-16 and I-15 fighters, with a small minority of more recent, but still mediocre types like the Lag-3. The older pair of Soviet fighter types were the creations of the Polikarpov Design Bureau. They were among the best fighters in service when introduced in the mid-1930s, and together they formed the backbone of the Soviet fighter force. Both had seen extensive combat in the recurrent fighting with the Japanese in the Manchurian region and in the Spanish Civil War, where they made up the greater part of the Republican fighter force during the fighting there. The I-15 was one of the last generation of biplane fighters, and among the best of its kind. It was unusual both for its stubby profile and the use of a gull-type upper wing with no center section projecting from the fuselage. It was equipped with a powerful radial engine, a 9-cylinder Shvetsov M25 developing 700 horsepower. The early development versions had used retractable landing gear. However, production models were fitted with conventional fixed wheels. It was armed with 4 machine guns, located around the engine. It was very maneuverable and fast for a biplane, though with a top speed of about 225 miles an hour or 365 kph, it was still outpaced by almost all German combat aircraft, including reconnaissance machines and bombers. The I-15 was not built for speed, but for agility, and it excelled in this kind of turning dogfight for which biplane fighters were so well adapted. The Russians called the I-15 the Chaika, or Seagull. The name was given on account of its gulled upper wing surfaces. During the Civil War in Spain, it became known as the Chato, a term that means flat-nosed, in reference to its stubby profile. Flat-nosed and stubby would also have described the I-16, the fighter alongside which the I-15 usually served. This aircraft was a small monoplane powered by a large radial engine, in this case another 9-cylinder Shvetsov, model M63, which was rated at 1,100 horsepower. At the time of its introduction, it was the only fighter aircraft in the world to use retractable landing gear in an enclosed cockpit. This latter innovation, however, was abandoned after the early production run and replaced with a windscreen only. Unusually for Soviet planes of the pre-war generation, most I-16s carried an oxygen system to allow high-altitude flight. The I-16 was not as maneuverable as its biplane counterpart, but this was not necessary due to the role the fighter was designed to play in combat. This was the first Russian design built to fight using the new kinds of tactics made possible by the monoplane fighter using a powerful engine. These tactics were based on superior speed, climb and dive performance, and heavy armament, rather than turning performance and aerobatic maneuverability. This plane was designed for speed, and it was very fast for a mid-1930s aircraft, top speed of about 325 miles per hour, or 525 kph, a fast rate of climb. In 1941, however, the I-16 was not as fast as the newer German fighters, which outclassed both of these fighters in all aspects of performance except for horizontal maneuverability. In addition, the I-16 was a difficult aircraft to fly, demanding a great deal from its pilot. It carried 2 7.62mm SHKAS machine guns in the nose, but Spanish experience against the German and Italian aircraft flown by Franco's Air Force and their allies pointed out the need for more firepower. Thus, another pair was added to the later versions, and some I-16s were fitted with heavier weapons including 12.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannon. These heavily armed variants were often used in a ground attack role, and were fitted with racks to carry a modest load of bombs or unguided rockets. In Spain, this plane had been branded the Rata, meaning rat, or sometimes the Mosca, meaning horsefly. Both of these planes were produced in large quantities before the war. Like many Soviet productions of the time, they were an odd mix of innovative ideas and unsophisticated execution. Accessory items that greatly increased the efficiency of a combat plane, and that would be taken for granted on later aircraft, such as radio gear and navigation aids, were still uncommon. At the same time, some advanced features such as controllable pitch air screws were used, well in advance of other major air powers. Be that as it may, both these fighters were definitely outdated in 1941. At the time of the German invasion, the pair were in the early stages of being replaced in Soviet service by a newer generation of fighter aircraft. This process was by no means complete, however, and in June 1941, 40% of the Soviet fighter force was still flying the I-16. The Lag-3 was a more modern monoplane fighter design that had begun to equip some frontline squadrons in the year before the invasion. It was a solid, fast machine, but it had been built to a Soviet requirement for a fighter made from non-strategic materials, which in this case means wood. As a result, it was somewhat heavier than the comparable fighters built from light metals, and its performance was affected. LAG pilots would complain of the plane's sluggish response to control inputs. LAG carried one heavy 12.7mm machine gun and a 20mm cannon. Although the plane was well armed, fast, and tough, it was nevertheless at a disadvantage against the German fighters. Among the Russian pilots, it was nicknamed the, quote, guaranteed varnished coffin. The LAG was encountered in the north alongside the MiG-3, a solid, though unremarkable modern design that was broadly comparable to the American P-40. Unlike the Curtiss fighter, it was designed as a high-altitude interceptor and was at its best above 15,000 feet or 4,600 meters. Unfortunately, almost all the air-to-air action along the Russian front was fought at low level, where the MiG-3's performance was only mediocre. It carried one 12.7mm machine gun and a pair of 6.2mm machine guns. The MiG would be produced throughout the war, but only in relatively small numbers, as the high-altitude niche it had been designed to fill had not become critical in the war against the Germans. The preponderance of the older Polikarpov fighters in the Russian squadrons flying in the far north was one of the reasons that the 110 could continue to find success here in a strategic fighter role. These machines were coming into service at the time of the 110's conception, and represented what the designers might have had in mind as the likely opponents of this heavy fighter. Against them in the LAGs, the Zerstorer usually had the advantage. After the opening months of the campaign, Allied Lend-Lease aid began to arrive, and the Arctic Air War became an affair of Messerschmitt 109s and 110s against the Anglo-American types, mostly Hurricanes, P-30s, and P-40s that were coming over with the convoys. The Russians were somewhat better served in terms of bomber aircraft, fielding large numbers of the modern SB-3 twin-engine medium bomber. As was the case with Soviet pilots in general, those found here were aggressive, brave, and often very skillful in handling their aircraft. However, the training of the Russians was often of a lower standard than that found in the air forces of the Germans and the Western Allies. One reflection of this was a critical weakness in the early months of the war, their tendency to use excessively rigid formations and stereotyped, predictable tactics. The Arctic sector was secondary in priority for both sides in terms of re-equipment with newer machines. As the battle progressed into 1943, Russian numbers would begin to increase, however. More advanced and formidable types, such as the Yak-9 fighter and the PE-2 bomber, as well as the formidable IL-2 attack plane, began to replace many of the Lend-Lease types. This double increase in quantity and quality of their opposition would make life harder for the German pilots. It took a little while for the air war in the Arctic to heat up, as their Zerstörers of 1Z JG-77 did not score their first victory until July 5th, when one of the pilots who had come with the Geschwader stab brought down an I-16 in the Lützow Valley. This kill was the only one scored by the Luftwaffe in the Arctic on this day. July 5th also saw the Zerstörers take their first loss, when one was destroyed by Soviet anti-aircraft fire near Lützow Bay. This time, the German forces in the area were fighting hard to secure the crossings of the Lützow River, and their advance in this sector was stalling. The most common employment of the Bf-110 was the escort to the Luftwaffe bombing raids on enemy positions in Murmansk and on the railroad. Initially, these raids were carried out by Stukas alone, but medium bombers soon joined in, and more medium bomber units were quick to arrive in the Arctic sector as well. The other major occupation of Zerstorer pilots was the protection of German coastal convoys, driving away air attack, and harassing enemy surface forces. In this role, they had a substantial tally of Russian bombers and flying boats, including license-built PBY Catalinas. An example of the kind of action that occurred during the raids on Murmansk, and for which the 110 was well suited, took place on July 21st. A group of 110s was flying cover for a formation of Ju-88 bombers. As the Germans approached the port, they spotted a group of 3 Russian twin-engine bombers coming in towards them. Diving on the unsuspecting enemy, the 110s dispatched all 3 and then resumed their escort mission. On missions such as these, the 110s were often released from escort duties after the bombers turned for home. Heavy fighters would often descend to low level and strafe targets of opportunity with their heavy cannon armament. Priority targets included airfields, where the Zerstorers accounted for many enemy aircraft on the ground. Communications objectives were also common targets for the marauding 110s. Like they had in Poland, the 110s made a specialty here of attacks on locomotives. In addition to these major missions, Zerstorers flew intruder and fighter bomber missions, carrying in these roles a pair of 250-kilogram bombs. Fighter sweeps over enemy territory, looking for targets of opportunity and trying to coax up Russian fighters, were also carried out, usually in cooperation with the single-engine fighters. A favorite tactic consisted of a few Bf-109s acting as bait to reveal enemy positions and tempt Russian fighters up into the air to combat. Some distance behind, a Bf-110 would follow and attack the unsuspecting enemy with its heavy guns as they took off in pursuit. One such action happened on July 13th, when a 3-ship formation of 109s made a low pass over a Russian airfield south of Murmansk. The creator of this tactic, Gerhard Schachke, another of the staff flight pilots, appeared in his Zerstörer as the Germans scrambled fighters in pursuit. Shoshki shot down 3 I-16s that attempted to take off, then performed a victory roll over the airfield and sped away. Shoshki attempted another such trick at the same field on August 4th, this time with 4 109s and 3 other 110s. The Russians responded with more fighters this time, including some of the newer Lag 3s. Shoshki took out 2 of the Russians in a single pass, but, distracted by the unexpected appearance of other Soviet planes returning to the airfield from another mission, missed one of the Lags which scored multiple hits on his aircraft. One engine smoking, fled back towards German-held territory but crashed on the way. He was killed in the crash, but his backseater, Michael Whitman, survived. When the Soviet troops approached the wrecked aircraft, he refused to surrender and died after a short exchange of small arms fire with the Russian soldiers. Tactics used by the 110 pilots would attempt to exploit the plane's strengths, namely speed and heavy armament. An attack a diving pass at high speed, followed by a quick disengagement or a climb to dive again, was the preferred method. This was a common way to fight in a heavier, less maneuverable aircraft that could not match its opponent in a turning fight. As we have noted in a previous episode, if the 110s found themselves at a disadvantage, they would usually form a defensive circle similar to the Luftwaffes of the First World War, where the planes would guard each other's tails. Perhaps unexpectedly, some of the fighting the Zerstorers would see in the first months of the Arctic War would be against not the Russians, but the British. Both British air arms, in fact, the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm, would tangle with the Germans in the early part of this campaign. First up were the Navy. A little over a month into the Russian War on July 30th, German reconnaissance aircraft sighted a British striking force built around the carriers Furious and Victorious. These ships had sailed from Scapa Flow on the 23rd, along with 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers, to take part in Operation Crucifixion. This was a strike against the German-held Arctic ports. The Soviets believed that Kirkenes and Petsamo were vital links in the logistical chain maintaining the German effort in the far north, and the mission was undertaken at their request. The carriers each brought 2 squadrons of torpedo bombers. The Victorious had 2 squadrons of new Albacores, while the Furious carried one of these planes and another of the older Swordfish. Both carriers also deployed a squadron of Fulmar 2-man fleet fighters. A few of the newer Sea Hurricanes were also embarked. These navalized versions of the RAF fighter were used to fly defensive air patrols above the carriers and did not participate in the strike mission. On the afternoon of the 30th, the carriers, about 80 miles northeast of Kirkenes, launched their strike aircraft. From the Victorias came the Albacores of numbers 827 and 828 squadrons, escorted by the Fulmars of 809 Squadron, headed to attack shipping in the supposedly crowded harbor. The planes of the Victorious Air Group represented the newest planes in the Navy's inventory. The Albacores were intended successors of the famous Swordfish biplane torpedo bomber. The Albacore was also a biplane, but was considerably more modern in its design. It was capable of carrying a single torpedo or a modest bomb load. In terms of performance, it remained, like its predecessor, hopelessly slow but surprisingly agile. The Fulmar was a successor to the Blackburn Skua. The inadequacies of the Skua as a fleet fighter were revealed in combat during the Norwegian campaign the year before. The new Fulmar was a big improvement, but like the Skua, it was handicapped as a fighter by the need to carry a second crewman. This was due to Fleet Air Arm doctrine, which required the fleet's fighter to carry a navigator. A consequent reduction in performance was thought to be less important, as it was thought that the fleet fighter would encounter mainly bomber and reconnaissance planes in its defensive role. The resulting aircraft was a very up-to-date monoplane with a formidable gun armament of 8 .303 caliber machine guns in the wings, and a comparatively long range. This would have made it very satisfactory in its intended role, but it left it at a deadly disadvantage against high-performance fighters. Against the 110, the Fulmar was a good match, with tactics and crew skill being the deciding factor in any engagement. Accounts differ in regard to the reception the British planes received. The British airmen claimed that they found the harbor alerted and in a state of defense, with shipping underway and fighters waiting for them in the air. German accounts indicate that the raid was not expected, despite the apparent contact made by the reconnaissance HE-111 hours earlier. One 110 pilot, part of a swarm of 4 Bf-110s escorting an outbound raid by Ju-88s towards Murmansk, reported sighting the unfamiliar aircraft approaching the harbor while forming up with their charges. They recognized them as British and dived into the attack. 9 Bf-109s returning from a raid joined into the attack and they came into the area, as did indeed the Stuka dive bombers that they had been escorting. The British reported only 3 ships in the harbor, a gunnery training vessel and a pair of middle-sized transports. They reported hits on these, but little damage seems to have been done. They were attacked by the Germans as they came in over the harbor and pursued well out to sea after making their attack runs. The escorting Fulmars attempted to break up the interception, but were at a disadvantage against the German planes. A total of 11 Albacores were brought down, amounting to more than half the force, as well as a pair of Fulmars. 6 of the British planes were shot down by the 110s. The Germans lost a single Zerstorer, probably to a Fulmar. The Ju-87 Stuka was also lost, shot down after an extended duel out over the water with an albacore, and was probably one of the most unusual and unique aerial combats of the war. Another strike, consisting of one squadron of 9 Swordfish bombers and another of 9 albacores escorted by more Fulmars, was flown off the deck of the Furious, this time targeting the harbor of Pitsamo. This strike received a much less hostile reception and got away with the loss of only one albacore and another pair of Fulmars. Like the Kirkenes raid, however, this attack achieved little. Very little shipping was in the harbor, and the bombs expended against the shore installations did insignificant damage. The Arctic ports were plainly not vital logistical links. Between this fact and the heavy losses taken by the victorious Air Group, British were persuaded not to repeat these kind of carrier raids. British carriers would later return to the northern seas to cover convoys plying between the UK and the Russian Arctic ports. These would usually be smaller escort carriers, not the big fleet carriers, however, and they would launch no more attacks on the sector in which the Zerstorers of the Arctic Air Fleet flew. The other incursion of British air units into the polar front consisted of a pair of Royal Air Force squadrons transported to the theater by the Navy. These came aboard the first of the Allied convoys to Russia, which was codenamed Dervish. This left Iceland for Murmansk on August 21st, and was a predecessor to the larger and more well-known PQ series of convoys. Dervish was mounted on a much smaller scale than these later efforts. Convoy consisted of only 6 merchant vessels, 5 British and 1 Dutch, with a Royal Navy escort. Part of this escort was the old carrier HMS Argus, carrying 151 wing of RAF Fighter Command. This unit was made up of number 81 and number 134 squadrons, equipped with a total of 24 Hurricanes. On September 7th, these planes took off from the ship and headed to their new base at Vaenga on the shores of the Kola Inlet. This formation was sent to the Soviet Union to serve as the equivalent of one of the operational training units back home. Its purpose was to train and familiarize Soviet pilots with the Hurricane fighter and its effective use in combat. They would then turn over their planes and equipment to their Russian protégés, who would use the fighters and train their countrymen to fly more to come. Hurricanes would form a major part of the aid sent to Russia, so the instruction of these squadrons was vital to ensure the best use of the new and unfamiliar type. British crew would then depart back to the UK on a ship that would be sent as part of a future convoy. As part of the training, British pilots would fly on operational missions, leading their Soviet students into combat. In the course of this on-the-job training, British pilots would engage in heavy combat with their German counterparts. Several British-flown aircraft were brought down by the Germans, but the RAF pilots only suffered 1 killed in action. The 110 Squadron here fought numerous actions against Hurricanes in this period. It is very likely that the Zerstorer men, some of whom were veterans of the fighting over England, met some of their old adversaries here in the fighting above the Arctic Ocean coastline. The men then turned their planes over to the Russians and left for home aboard the cruiser HMS Kenya. It was the first appearance of the Hurricane in Russian service, and the first manifestation of Western aid to Russia in the air. Many more Hurricanes would follow, and the British machines were commonly encountered by the Arctic Zerstorer pilots for the next 2 years. However, most of the action the Zerstorer units would have seen up until this time would have been against the older Russian types, Polikarpov I-16s and I-15s, and this would continue to be the case for a few weeks longer until the stocks of these mid-30s designs in Russian hands became exhausted. The 110s achieved a notable success on October 24th when the squadron became involved in a drawn-out battle with a large formation of both of these types. The 110s shot down 7 of the Soviet planes, with no recorded loss of their own. Most of the Bf-110's missions in the month of October were ground attack missions undertaken in support of a renewed German ground offensive along the Litza River line. As the polar winter and darkness closed in, more and more German units were compelled to redeploy to the southern portion of the sector. The Zerstorer squadron began the move from Kirkenes to Rovaniemi on the 30th of October, with all of its machines making the transfer in by the first days of October. Even here, however, the severe winter weather hindered operations. Temperatures could drop to negative 40 degrees, and the period of daylight was very short. Nevertheless, they persisted in mounting attacks on the Murmansk Railroad and would keep these up as the year came to a close. Redesignation of units came not long after the new year in consequence of the Luftwaffe reorganization that brought the units here under the umbrella of Luftwaffe 5. The fighter component of this command, JG-5, had come into existence at this time, but the 110 Squadron retained its original designation of 1Z JG-77. It only received a new squadron number more fitting with its new parent unit in February of 1942. The squadron then became 10Z JG-5. Further changes would come throughout the course of the squadron's tour in the Arctic, changing later to 14Z JG-5 and then to 6Z JG-5. Nonetheless, the squadron remained the sole 110 unit in this sector of the Russian front, and remained more or less the same level of strength. At the beginning of the campaign, the squadron was equipped with various marks of the Bf-110C. Over the course of its service here, it would be equipped successively with later models of the aircraft. The relevant variants were the D model, a long-range variant particularly suitable for convoy protection and maritime patrol, and the E model, a more powerful and ruggedly built model specialized in ground attack. The adoption of these more specialized types reflects the change which gradually occurred in the kind of mission the squadron was flying as time went on. As more formidable opposition gradually built up in the air, the 110s were taken off of pure air superiority duties. Increasingly, they were employed in ground attack missions using their powerful cannon armament and a moderate bomb load to attack Russian ground targets. The major call in their services would be performed out over the Arctic Ocean, protecting German coastal traffic from long-range Allied aircraft as well as taking part in actions against the convoys bringing in aid from the west. The coming of the spring months enabled the Luftwaffe to move back to the northern fields, and they were directed to make convoys from the west their top priority. Up till now, British convoys were regularly making the run to Murmansk with little interference, and with virtually no losses, and the Germans were now determined to cut off this flow of supplies and munitions. From March to September, the Zerstörers, along with other fighters, would escort many bombing attacks on Allied shipping, both at sea and when they were docked in Murmansk. These attacks were often mounted in conjunction with the U-boat arm of the Navy. Allied shipping losses rose dramatically, but the flow of aid over the Arctic Ocean routes was never cut off. Soviets would mount spoiling attacks on the German air bases to prevent attacks on the incoming ships, and fierce air battles were fought all along the northern coast and its environs. These air battles centered around the anti-convoy effort intensified through the months of April and May. On May 10th, for example, the fighters of JG-5 destroyed a total of 27 Soviet planes in the course of a number of small actions. This was the most successful day of the Arctic War for the Zerstorer squadron, which accounted for 16 enemy aircraft that day, a mixture of MiG-3s and Hurricanes. 5 of these were the work of Theo Weissenberger, placing him in the very small proportion of combat pilots who can claim ace in a single day status. Some of the Arctic pilots racked up impressive kill numbers while flying the Zerstorer. Felix Maria Brandes, the commander of the Zerstorer squadron when it was transferred to the far north, was the early leader. At the time of his death in early February 1942, he had 14 kills. He was surpassed among Arctic Zerstorer aces only by the above-mentioned Theo Weissenberger, who claimed 23 kills in the aircraft before transferring to Bf-109s. This man was the highest-scoring ace in the Arctic, amassing more than 200 kills. He would end the war flying the Me-262 jet fighter. The effort against the convoys would continue to occupy the Zerstorers until the end of their employment in the theater, with some periods of intensive ground attack activity intervening during the sporadic periods of fighting that erupted along the Litsa riverfront. But by the middle of 1943, the increasing quality and quantity of Russian air opposition was beginning to make the Bf-110 less useful in the far north. In addition to better marks of the Allied Lend-Lease planes, more formidable Russian planes such as the Yak-9 and the Il-2 began to be encountered in quantity. The last major success of the Zerstorers in this theater came on the 25th of July 1943, when a swarm of Bf-110s flying convoy protection over Varanger Ford intercepted a force of Russian PE-2 bombers and brought down 4 of them. Zerstorers would continue to operate in the Arctic for the rest of the year, but they were increasingly restricted to convoy protection operations, while fighter tasks were left entirely to single-seat machines, and their ground attack functions performed by the new Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bomber variants. On January 25, 1944, the Zerstorers left Kirkenes on their first stage of their journey back to Stavanger on the Norwegian coast to resume their maritime patrol duties there. This redeployment underlines the continued utility of the Zerstorer in this capacity. Even at this comparatively mature phase of the air war in the West, when the Allies were fielding more formidable aircraft, the 110s proved useful against Allied naval and reconnaissance aircraft over the northern seas. In this war of solitary duels with Allied patrol planes and low-level battles with long-range strike planes above the Cold Wars of the Arctic and the North Sea, they were to claim a respectable bag of RAF foe fighters and liberators. So that's about it for this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting and useful. This concludes my survey of the career of the 110 in its original offensive heavy fighter role. We have seen in some detail how the plane was used in the attack, either in air-to-air combat against a variety of European air forces flying a wide variety of aircraft types, or in their evolving capacity as a close support and maritime patrol plane. In this role, we have seen the 110 flew in just about every theater in which the Germans were engaged. The next episode will conclude this series as a whole by looking at the use of the 110 as a defensive weapon, as a bomber-destroyer fighting against the formations of American and British 4-engine heavy bombers that would appear in large numbers over Germany and occupied Europe from the mid-war years on. As time went on, this would become their primary commitment, and larger numbers of the twin-engine fighter would operate in this capacity than in all the offensive actions we have surveyed so far. So I hope you'll join me for that. And until then, I remain Mark 7, as always, wishing you all the best.